You know, the scriptures tell us that without a vision, my people perish. And when we look at the agenda of the environmental program, we see that the agenda is to bring about confusion and despair, as well as bring about a sense of such well-being and such contentment in our homes that we are just content to stay in our homes and not reach out to those individuals who are in trouble. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about our land and the fact that we're in a war, some of the individual cases that I've been involved in, and some of the things that we can do to stop the onslaught of attack against private ownership. Ladies and gentlemen, when this country was first founded, it was founded upon the principle of understanding who our highest authority was, and great respect for that authority. Our founding fathers almost unanimously realized that God Almighty was the ultimate authority. They realized that God created man, and then man created the Constitution, and out of the Constitution came the authority for our tryout of government to be set up. And out of the legislative branch came the creation of laws, and out of the creation of laws came the creation of regulation. Out of the judiciary came the creation of case law. So we have the highest authority, God, man, Constitution, statutory law, regulatory law, and then case law. So they understood that the lowest form of law are ordinances, or also regulations. There was a clear line of authority in our legal system, but today we find that line of authority completely switched upside down. So that today we see case law forbidding students to read their Bibles in public school. Today we see regulations that disallow God in our schools and in our other institutions, while the state and national legislatures still open every day of business with a prayer. The hypocrisy that goes on with just that is something that people are beginning just to accept. And ladies and gentlemen, to accept these inconsistencies and to live with them with contentment is one of our biggest dangers. You see, I remember when I was a little girl and Khrushchev came over to America, and he said in the United Nations, and he was well televised, everybody had to watch Khrushchev, and I watched him too out of great interest, as he pounded his shoe on the table and told us that he would conquer, the Russians would conquer America and they wouldn't have to fire one shot. You know, we didn't think that was humanly possible. But when we look at what war really is and what the results of war really are over the history of our civilizations, we're going to have to take a good hard look at where we are today. You see, wars used to be fought between physical bodies. Armies used to clash. Individuals used to clash in battle. The war was for conquering the physical army, and then moving in and conquering the physical land, and thereby changing the culture. What happened since Khrushchev pounded his shoe on the table in the United Nations was that the war changed. Yes, we've had wars, but they were no longer wars where the United States of America generals could command their armies in their own field. No, we had wars that were run by Joint Chiefs of Staff who were responsible to the United Nations. The whole complexion of war changed. America never had the clear victory after that. And then we quietly moved into the War of Souls. Ladies and gentlemen, if by definition we understand that we are made up as human beings of three general parts, the physical, the spiritual, and the soul. And if the soul is the mind, will, and emotions, we've got to understand that's where the battleground is now, because they're coming at us to get our soul. They're coming at our young people through education and through the entertainment media to capture their souls, so that we no longer invest our emotion and our time, energy, and intelligence in fighting for principle, because we are being lulled by today's mental marijuana, whether it be the television, whether it be contentment and more time off, or whatever it may be. We are no longer compelled to go out and fight the battle in the front lines, which today is in your county commission meetings, which are in the halls of your legislature, in the halls of Albany, or in the Congress of the United States. That's where the battleground is defined. The war is just as surely as much a war today as it ever has been. Because you see, today, ladies and gentlemen, we are already in bondage for nearly half of the investment of our time, energy, and intelligence, the loss of the vision of accomplishment and profit, because we invest nearly half of our time, or from January 1 through May 14th, just to pay our taxes. When we were in bondage in Egypt, when God's people were in bondage in Egypt, it wasn't for any more than 40%. When we study the history of what happened when the Israelites were in bondage in Egypt, there was a mere 3 to 4% tax on the tea when the patriots dumped tea in the harbor. The serfs in England were taxed at a rate of about 1/3 that they must give up to the master, the large holder of the manor. Ladies and gentlemen, we're taxed not to the point of rebellion, which would have been dangerous. They could have never really captured us. We're taxed very slowly, and our freedoms are very slowly being taken away. And we've got to come back to this point, that God Almighty, and I'm not here to talk to you, I'm not a preacher, and I'm not here to preach to you, I simply know this to be true, that in the Old Testament, time after time, God told his people that if we didn't follow his precepts, we would be in bondage. And if today we can't see that that's where we are and why we're there, we don't have a clear vision. We've lost our vision. In 2 Chronicles 7:14, the scriptures tell us that God had said, if my people who are called by my name turn from their wicked ways and seek my face and pray, then I will hear them from heaven, and I will restore their land. Ladies and gentlemen, that's step number one. We need to know who we are in relationship to our Creator. Because our forefathers had such a strong sense of the relationship between God, man, and law, men like Samuel Adams wrote in 1772 that the absolute rights of Englishmen and all free men in or out of civil society are principally personal security, personal liberty, and private property. I could quote you forefather after forefather who laid out the fact that private property is the very linchpin to our freedoms. John Locke, remember the very famous English empiricist, wrote in the middle of the 17th century, about 1630, a very interesting treatise where he concluded that there is no divine right of kings, that it's men who have the divine rights that come from God, of life, liberty, the ability to pursue happiness, and the right to private ownership. Our land prospered because there was an understanding that we could apply our own God-given creative energies to the land and acquire wealth. This land, because of that relationship between man and the earth, rose to the highest level of standards of living in the history of civilization. It's very interesting that when we look at the scriptures in Genesis 2, we find that God, in Genesis 2, God looked for man to till the soil, and then he created Adam. After he had created the earth, created everything on the earth, gave man dominion over the earth, looked for a man to till the soil, and then he created Adam. This was a God-fearing nation, and this nation was blessed because it was able to retrieve the wealth out of the earth. We became a wealthy nation. You see, the bottom line is, unless we're able to mine, mill, or harvest the wealth out of the earth, we become a poorer nation. Wealth was created by God for man in the earth. Wealth is not created in the printing presses in Washington, D.C. It's contained in the earth. If we're able to farm the earth, if we're able to get in and mine the minerals out of the earth, log the timber off the earth, mine the riches out of the sea, in proportion to that ability to have that kind of freedom from the earth, we become a richer nation. But as we look at the encroachment of the environmental movement and what it means to moving man away from the earth, we see that as the environmental movement and moved forward, we have become a debtor nation more and more. And today, isn't it interesting, but seldom do we see the major political candidates talking about the environmental movement. Oh, they bewail the fact that we are in a recession, but somehow they're not equating the fact that if we could get back in and get the minerals out of the earth, get our steel mills up again, get our farmers doing what they know best to do, we would become a more prosperous nation. For some reason, known or unknown to them, they're not putting it together for the public to understand it. We cannot get George Bush or Bill Clinton to talk about the environment other than debating over Al Gore's book. Because of the understanding that I've just described, America flourished. But then in the middle of the 18th century, two hombres got together, well-funded by the name of Marx and Engels, and they put together the Communist Manifesto. One of the first major planks in the Communist Manifesto deals with how the communist state envisioned the elimination of private property, and I quote from the Communist Manifesto. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: the abolition of private property. In one word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so, that's just what we intend to do. Of greater significance and in frightening detail, that Communist Manifesto laid out a series of sequential steps by which they were going to go about accomplishing the abolition of private property. Among those steps were the abolition of property and land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. Today we call it taxes. The abolition of all rights of inheritance. That battle has waxed and waned in the halls of the legislatures and in the United States Congress. The confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to remember this, because I'm going to tell you some stories about cases that I have. And then a series of steps by which the control of credit and capital, factories and instruments of production, means of communication, transportation, energy, would all be centralized. And that's where we are. While the walls went down around the red nations, they've come up around America. While overseas, they're trying to talk people into taking private land and train these people in just a couple short years how to be free enterprisers when they grew up under the terror of communism and understanding the only thing that they knew was that they had to look to Big Daddy for their very existence. Now they're all of a sudden telling these people, okay, you can have the land, but you live off the land. We're going to give you all this freedom. While in America, they're beginning to take our land from us. You know, year after year, the United States Supreme Court and high courts in the states have agreed that private property rights are absolutely essential. However, the courts have been all over the map. Our problem is that we don't have attorneys enough who are going to take these cases and combine the private property rights, the civil rights, the constitutional rights, and really push it all the way through. We've had some, and they have emerged out of the United States Supreme Court, such as in the case in 1972 in the Warren Court entitled Lynch versus Household Finance. That is a landmark case, and that Warren Court, much to our surprise, wrote, property does not have rights. People have rights. The right to enjoy property without unlawful deprivation is no less than the right to speak or the right to travel, and is in truth a personal right. The court went on to write that in fact a fundamental interdependence exists between the personal right to liberty and the personal right to property, and neither can have meaning without the other. Pretty significant. And then followed up in 6 years, the California Supreme Court, which has always been known as a very liberal court, the court that spawned Rose Bird and a few other really left-wing liberals, wrote, it is a principle of universal law that wherever the right to own property is recognized in the free government, practically all other rights become worthless if the government possesses an uncontrollable power over the property of the citizen. That California Supreme Court echoed what Samuel Adams wrote in 1772. Ladies and gentlemen, what happened was that the ideals of the Communist Manifesto and the ideals of our forefathers have come into a direct clash, and we are now in a struggle, in a war as real as any other war we've ever fought. You know, let's look back and understand very clearly what again motivated our people to become the entrepreneurs that they did, as far as being able to be good land managers. You see, our forefathers and our congressmen envisioned this land being peopled with productive individuals from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the northern borders to the southern borders. And so they passed incentive pieces of legislation. You know, they said, go west, young man, go west. And if you'll risk the rigors of taking your family and your few possessions west, we will reward you by passing the Homestead Act of 1862 and allowing you, Mr. Head of the family, to have 160 acres. And if your wife is a productive member of your family, which all wives were then, they worked so hard, we will give another 80 acres to your family, and for each child that is a productive member and can work in the fields, we will give you another 80 acres. And we'll give you 7 years to prove up. And what you have to do to prove up is within 7 years you have to build a homestead home. And you have to demonstrate to us when we come out there that you have properly filed your homestead lands, and you have the capabilities of working the land you have filed on. Good luck, we're behind you, go to it. The American people responded to calls like that, and they went west. A lot of them didn't make it, but with the vision clearly in front of them, they risked, and they went west. The initial Homestead Act of 1862 was followed by the Southern Homestead Act of 1866, which, in addition to the Homestead Act, which broke our prairie grass lands into an agrarian land, and the lands west were broken out of the Homestead Act, the Southern Homestead Act helped break out some of the southern states, as well as Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and Colorado. Then in 1892, Congress passed the Timber and Stone Act. And that act opened up the Northeast and the Northwest and the Southeast, where we could really entice people into logging and clearing and opening up for good, sound land practices, the timber areas. Oddly enough, ladies and gentlemen, there was another very interesting act that was passed. You see, the Congress found that there were millions of acres of land in this great nation that had alluvial soils, but these areas had standing water on them. And in the debate in the Congress, they argued that there are many lands, but they are swamp and overflowed lands unfit for cultivation. And so they reasoned that if, again, the government could help people by opening up their lands, giving them the 160 acre plus 80 acres per family, benefits from the normal Homestead Act, plus send federal technicians out to these lands to show them how to build tiles under the ground and drainage systems, we could open up the entire Midwest to cultivation. These were swamps by definition. By today's definition, ladies and gentlemen, they would be called wetlands. And by definition, a lot of these farmers in the states that I'm going to name are having to battle the bureaucracy, because we have bureaucrats coming on their land asking if they can see any beaver ponds, any trouble draining, any standing water. And so our people are so used to being open and honest, they say, sure, down here on the South 40, gosh, I've got about 10 acres I've had trouble draining. We've got cattails growing up in there, and you know, years ago we built a beaver pond. My grandkids love to fish out of the beaver pond, and sure, I'll take you out and show you. We've got this beaver pond out there, and so what happens is they go out and they take a map of all the wetlands, and then they send a letter to the farmer that these are wetlands and characteristic, and we have to have a buffer zone around the wetlands to preserve them, and so you may not plant your crop on that 40 next time. It's happening over and over and over again in our farming communities. Out of the swampland grants, we broke out fully 65 million acres into private ownership, into productive agrarian land. 65 million acres. Out of those acres were lands in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Michigan, Arkansas, Wisconsin, Iowa, Florida, California, Minnesota, and Oregon. today, as I say by definition, those people who thought they had a perfect right to their land, that their ancestors broke out by definition, now that is being considered wetland. We are seeing our land being taken over at a rate that is absolutely astounding. Whereas every day the news screams at us about the Dow Jones average, the unemployment rates. I mean, we have indexes coming out our ears that the media chooses to tell us about. But you would be surprised if you did a study in your own county, if you, just in your own county here, could understand the land that the federal government controls. You know, the federal government cannot own land, but as specified in the United States or Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, but what they do is control the land. And so the land that is taken out of the tax rolls, and thus shifting the tax burden to the fewer landholders, is absolutely astounding. And I'd like to challenge this organization here tonight to make that study. If we could make that study county by county, we would then begin to have a pictorial demonstration of what I'm talking to you about tonight. Because mostly we thought that the federal land was contained west of the 100th meridian. That's wrong. I mean, one of the things that really woke us up out there in the west as to what you people were going through was the Cuyahoga Valley land grab. And then we woke up to the Adirondack land grab. But we have had one land grab after the other, and I call it land grab, ladies and gentlemen, because it's not polite. It diminishes our wealth. It diminishes our security in this nation. We need to be able to get into the mines and mine those necessary minerals, those rare earth minerals, if we're to be productive in the world as far as our military weaponry system, but as far as also new technology. We have great resources of rare earth minerals in Idaho under the Sawtooth National Recreation Area. The USGS reports in its manuals that that area alone contains the richest untapped hard rock mining area in the North American continent, but we can't get to it. We're playing on it. In the Kalamiopsis Forest in Oregon, they have the richest untapped reserve and the purest form of chrome. But where do we get our chrome? Does anyone know? Sure, Rhodesia and South Africa and sometimes Russia. But we've got a spotted owl over there in Oregon. Beside, that's on a national forest. I was called by some of the timber people into Oregon to work with them on the spotted owl issue to try to bring a political perspective, try to get the attention of the White House, because you see the buck stops with the president. He's the chief executive officer of this country. It's his agents and his agencies that are enforcing these ridiculous programs, but we couldn't. We continued to go ahead and work, but first when I went over there, I asked to see the survey maps that had been conducted, the surveys that had been conducted by the Fish and Wildlife Agency to try to get an understanding of how they surveyed the spotted owl. What in the world would give them the idea that the spotted owl needed 11.4 million acres for its habitat? I mean, you just give about 6 of us in this room, good, strong, free enterprisers, about 10 breeding pairs of spotted owls, and pay us an incentive to provide spotted owls for this generation and the next generation. We have more spotted owls than we know what to do with. So you see, the issue isn't the spotted owl, the issue isn't the snail darter, the issue isn't the bald eagle, the issue is controlling the resources. So as I looked at these maps and I found that the spotted owls were surveyed about a half mile on each side of the road, I was surprised. And I thought, well, maybe this is because they like roadkill. And if they like roadkill, then they're not very endangered. But we decided to call the people in who did the survey to see what their purpose was. And their excuse was to have an endangered species that liked to snuggle up next to roads. And they said, well, the problem is that we are so busy that we couldn't take the surveys over the mountain ridges as designated. No, what they did was they drove their vehicles up the road and they could only walk in a half mile on each side to survey the owl habitat. They calibrated the owl habitat 1/2 mile on each side of the road out over millions and millions of acres. Ladies and gentlemen, it spans 3 states, from Washington, Oregon to Northern California. Isn't it interesting? You see, the environmental movement has no respecter of state boundaries. So there we begin to break down the sovereignty of our states. It's very interesting that acid rain is no respecter of the boundary between Canada and the United States of America. Although the Supreme Court in the recent decision, Lujan versus National Wildlife Federation, I believe, about some Americans who were trying to protect wildlife in Africa, the Supreme Court said that you have to have an actual injury in fact, and we have no business trying to regulate what's going on in other countries. I thought, thank goodness, the Supreme Court really did wake up. But indeed, that's what we're trying to do through the auspices of the United Nations. And that's what the summit in Rio was all about, in order to get money out of the United States at a huge amount in order to support the United Nations enforcement people. You see, ladies and gentlemen, when we look at the lands that contain great wealth, either under the earth or on top of the earth, or great beauty, which translates into high value, such as in the Adirondacks, we find that these environmental zones where man has either already been pushed out or will continue to be pushed out are areas of great wealth. And these environmental zones also are occurring in countries around the world, especially in debtor nations. You see, they understand where the wealth is contained, and those areas have become collateral to the World Bank for our nation's debt. It's just like what Deep Throat said. You just follow the money. And when Edmund Burke said that men are seldom disposed to give up their liberties except under some pretext of necessity, we realize the American people, by and large, have been absolutely twitter-pated and twinkle-dusted into believing that at the risk of private ownership and the inherent God-given rights, that men are simply giving up and rolling over and allowing this to happen. You know, I go back to the spotted owl through this whole thing. And although we pled with them and we pled with the administration to wake up and understand the ramifications of what was going to happen, there is no one more hard-hearted than the intellectual community. No one more hard-hearted than those who would say, these issues are so complex, we don't have a simple answer. Those who would try to confuse our people. You know our God is not the God of confusion. And like Robert Welch said, ladies and gentlemen, this is a spiritual war. This is a war between God, our Creator, and His people, and the forces of evil who would try to move us off this earth. It's as simple as that. And in doing so, they try to confuse us with issues such as the spotted owl. But you know, sometimes people get so fed up, they just decide, I'm just going to bail out of this society, and I'm going to go live off the land. And there was one such man in Oregon who decided that he just had it. He was a very smart man, but he decided he was going to go live off the land. And I'll tell you, the way to do that is that you start going barefoot in the wintertime, and you start wearing these kind of dirty clothes, and you grow a scraggly beard and a mustache, and you don't take a bath very often, you smell pretty bad, and you look a little wild-eyed, and you tell the Forest Service that that's your cabin out there that you built, and that's what you claim, and you scare them to death, and they're going to leave you alone. Well, this guy had that all figured out, and so he built himself a cabin out in the forest in Oregon, and survived. He did very well. He'd come to town to get his grub steak, and he'd always come barefooted, and so that was a sure sign. This guy's gone over the edge, so we leave him alone. Well, one winter he was very, very ill, and he used up all the store of food that he had in his cabin that winter, and he was nearly starving in the springtime. So he loaded up his shotgun, and he knew that he had to get some protein, or he was going to die. He was going to starve. So he loaded up his shotgun, he wobbled out to the front porch, and he took a bead on a spotted owl up there in the tree, and he blasted away and let him have it. And the spotted owl toppled out of the tree, and he goes over and he picks up the owl, and he drags him into the cabin, and he plucks him up and throws him in the pot and boils him up and eats him. My goodness, he not only shot an endangered species, he cannibalized one. And so, you know, the Fish and Wildlife Service honestly does have a program that they pay people very well for spying on their neighbors if they hurt an endangered species or kill one. Well, sure enough, he was caught. And so he was, ultimately, it was a very colorful case. It was followed very well in the press. And he was hauled off to the Federal District Court in Eugene, Well, he didn't want a court-appointed attorney. He didn't trust them guys, and so he decided to do his own pro se work. And so he did. He put together a very good pro se case, and his strategy was to throw himself on the mercy of the court and say, Your Honor, I just plead with you, Your Honor, that you would realize that there should be a higher value in a human's life than the life of a spotted owl. That really man has to be the superior species of the race. And I had no choice. This was an emergency. If it hadn't been for that, being able to eat the owl, I would have died. And the judge was persuaded by the man's forceful argument and well-articulated position, and so he couldn't let him off the hook without lecturing him. And he said to that man, with the press in there taking lots of notes, he said, now, I want you, before I make a decision on this case, I want you to promise me that you will never, never, never again harm an endangered species. You are a smart man. You put together a smart case. You live off the land. You know the difference. I want you to promise me and promise this court you'll never harm another endangered species. And so he said, oh, I promise, Your Honor. Oh, no, I wouldn't harm an endangered species. Not on your life, I promise you, Your Honor. So the judge brings the gavel down and he says, case dismissed. And the press gathered around him wanting a comment because, as you can imagine, it was a high-profile case with all that local color. And then the judge said, gavelled the noise down, and he said, now just a minute, I want to know just one thing. What does a spotted owl taste like? And the little man looked up at the judge and he said, well, Your Honor, to be very truthful, a spotted owl sort of tastes like a combination between a bald eagle and a condor. That's a gotcha. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if it isn't massive wilderness acts that we experienced west of the 100th meridian, it's the Endangered Species, or it's a Clean Water Act, or it's a Clean Air Act, or it's any number of other acts. You know, in the Endangered Species Act, just in the spotted owl case, they have very cold-heartedly thrown 133,000 people out of work. And we thought, surely, in this year of presidential elections, this wouldn't happen. George Bush wouldn't allow it. Well, he wonders why he's 17 points behind in the polls. He did allow it. And whoever our president may be in the future, we've got to realize the buck stops with the president in the activities of the agencies. In the southeast, another great timbering area that is very necessary to our home building industry. It's odd that the cost of homes continue to go up, but it isn't odd when we realize the lumber alone has gone up 30% in this last year and a half. In the southeast, we don't have a spotted owl. We have what they call a skull-pated woodpecker that spans 4 states down there in the greatest timber harvesting regions in the southeast. Well, this fellow isn't as fussy as a spotted owl who likes to live in old-growth Douglas fir. No, this little skull-pated woodpecker likes to live in dead and dying pine. So there's no problem finding dead and dying pine. Dead and dying pine is now becoming the protected habitat of the skull-pated woodpecker. And not only that, the skull-pated woodpecker is not the majestic red-headed woodpecker that we read about and that we like so well. No, this is a frumpy, little, brown, ugly woodpecker. Nobody would want to look at the skull-pated woodpecker, but because of the skull-pated woodpecker, they are now controlling the landing and takeoff patterns out of Lockheed Air Force Base because they don't want to upset the breeding habitat of the skull-pated woodpecker. Now, what kind of sense does it make to you or to me that a bird that beats his head on a log all day long to get food is going to be upset by a plane flying overhead? It makes no sense at all. But we don't ask the common sense questions. You know, we buy off on our, quote, scientific community today saying the earth is warming. We have a global warming trend, and there is nothing we can do about it except be good, obedient little people and do everything that we tell you to do. Isn't it strange that those same, quote, quote, scientist stars were saying just 10 years ago that we were facing a new ice age? Remember that? Headed by one Carl Sagan, who finally found out that he could be a great star in his scientific world, and my goodness, he's rendering confusion on the American people. Isn't it interesting that most of the time the temperatures that are taken come out of weather stations that are located in airports, where there's miles and miles and miles of concrete that get very warm? That's the data that they use. But the data, as far as the Earth's temperature that comes out of the satellites that takes the temperature in the oceans and around all the countries, even the uncivilized countries that don't have sophisticated airports and weather stations, show that the Earth indeed is not warming. They say that we have too much carbon dioxide in the air. Oh my, too much carbon dioxide. What are we going to do about all this carbon dioxide? Well, you know, they fail to equate the fact that even when we were little children, we were taught that plants breathe carbon dioxide. And in order to have a very flush Earth that's very green, we need the greening effect, because the greening effect, or carbon dioxide, is the very molecular connection between the atmosphere and the Earth. In Livermore Laboratories in California, they did a controlled study on the effects of more carbon dioxide than normally occurs outside of a controlled study. And so they piped in about 80% more carbon dioxide in this controlled study, and their plants grew 200% more leaves and sturdier stalks and higher, healthier plants. But you know, that common sense argument escapes them and the press. And we have Freon that is no longer available as it used to be, and we see companies capturing certain markets, whether it be the asbestos market or the Freon market or whatever, in this environmental rush. Some companies are becoming exceedingly wealthy because of the panic that is being perpetrated. It's time we wake up. Ladies and gentlemen, you know, in addition to the Endangered Species Act, we saw another gross piece of legislation that was passed. It was called the Clean Water Act. In 1972, the Congress was in debate about the necessity to clean up the Great Lakes and all navigable streams. And so they passed the Clean Water Act without one word in it that said wetlands, without one word saying wetlands in the act. They gave the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers the authority to promulgate the rules and regulations to carry out the intent of the Clean Water Act. It's interesting. The Clean Water Act was to clean up the Great Lakes and navigable streams. And now we normally, our common sense would tell us navigable streams would be streams that boats and ships could carry commerce on, right? Wrong. The Army Corps of Engineers was allowed to write their own regulations as to what a navigable stream was. Beside writing in wetlands, they wrote in that a navigable stream is a stream that floats a 4-inch log. Hardly a stream that could float a ship. Hardly a stream that could carry a canoe. Hardly a stream that could carry a raft, really, if it could float a 4-inch log. Well, they weren't finished yet, because very friendly lawsuits were brought about. And these lawsuits, 2 of them brought by the National Resource Defense Council and then the Sierra Club, well funded by the same insiders that want to control our land, because we're seeing a concentration of wealth and power in their hands. These lawsuits were brought, and a federal district judge said that all tributaries that feed into navigable streams are under the jurisdiction of the federal government. So from the Great Lakes to navigable streams, into 4-inch log streams, into all tributaries that feed into these streams, we saw state water rights go out the window, and we saw the government have control of all water. In addition to that, they weren't through with a second friendly lawsuit that they brought. The federal judge, and this was not appealed, the federal judge said that all property adjacent to any of the navigable streams or streams under the jurisdiction of the United States that had characteristics of wetlands, whether that property was private or public, fell under the jurisdiction of the federal government. And so the government was able to get its hands on our private property through the Clean Water Act, which was supposed to clean up the Great Lakes. They went on to define what a wetland is. A wetland, by regulation, is defined as an area that has 15 consecutive days of standing water. Now, 2 out of these 4 criteria, and you have a wetland. If you dig down 18 inches beneath the surface, if there's moisture down there, that's characteristic of wetlands. That's what's getting our farmers in the Midwest. And the 4th criteria is if there's hydric soils on the land. Hydric soils are soils that from one time or another during the creation of this, at the beginning of the creation until now, if there was standing water or ice on these hydric soils for a period of time that caused a starvation of oxygen, soils become hydric in nature and they never return to their original nature. So we have hydric soils on mountaintops, but nevertheless, hydric soils are the fourth criteria. Well, then the federal government got busy with everything that they had in place with their case law and their regulations, and they decided to start making examples of the American people, because George Bush had said in 1988 there will be no net loss of our nation's wetlands, bogs, marshes, and swamps. And so William E. Riley, who is head of the EPA, a very close friend of the Bush family, and a man whose last job was the executive director of Lawrence Rockefeller's National Land Use Planning Commission, who never had a job where he gained any kind of respect for private ownership, is now the head of the enforcement agency for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers enforcing wetlands. You see, we aren't supposed to have the military enforce civil rights, right? It's kind of chilling that we have the military, the Army Corps of Engineers, being able to seize our land, but they do it through the Environmental Protection Agency, who is their enforcement agency. The first case that I became really acquainted with was a case involving O.C. Mills down in Pensacola, Florida. A 54-year-old retired contractor who owned some land in Pensacola decided to help his son Kerry build a home down there, and they needed to clean out one of their own irrigation ditches. And so they went to the Florida Department of Natural Resources and asked for a permit to clean out their own ditch. They were advised, no, the Clean Water Act exempts irrigation ditches, and so you're exempt. So they went back, got their shovels, and had cleaned out 300 feet of their own irrigation ditch when the EPA came in and arrested them for crimes against the United States of America for failing to go to the Army Corps of Engineers properly. We all thought this was a bad dream. But they stood trial in the federal district court, were found guilty, and sentenced to 18 months in a federal penitentiary, and both of them were fined $5,000. They were sentenced under a sentencing act so that they were allowed to get out on parole after about 8 months. But it was a pretty sad commentary, absolutely nonsensical, absolutely tragic. Now, a condition of the Mills, both the father and the son, being let out of prison was that the judge said, you have to go back to your home and you have to break a dike that would allow for flooding of about half of your land. And you have to create a wetlands. You know, many of us said to O.C. Mills, O.C., please don't do that. If there's anything that we can do to persuade that judge, please don't do that. That will set a horrible precedent. And O.C. Mills said, if you can persuade my wife that it's the right thing to do for me to go back to jail, then I won't do it. But the judge made it a condition upon my freedom. And our families have just about been through enough. Can you blame him? I couldn't. Another case that I've been deeply involved in is a case involving a Hungarian freedom fighter by the name of John Pozsgai from Morrisville, Pennsylvania. John Pozsgai was a first lieutenant in the Hungarian army when the Red Army moved into Hungary. And he will tell you that when the Red Army told him to turn fire on his own men, he made a valiant escape, and with about 8 other men, they helped plan the revolution that the rebels had. Remember, he was a rebel. And they held back the communists for a certain period of time while the Hungarians said to the Americans, please come and help us. We don't want to live under communism. Please come and help us. As a little girl, I couldn't understand why our president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, didn't respond to the Hungarians. Why in the world did he let a wall go up around Berlin? Why didn't he respond to the Hungarians? It wasn't until later, much later, that I realized Eisenhower had an agreement with Stalin that if there was any uprising in any of the satellite nations around Russia, America would not assist. That we had been allies in World War II and we would just let the communists do their deeds and not be the protector of freedom. John Pozsgai was one of the few who escaped with his life. He came to America. He escaped to America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. To him, the beacon of light and hope in the world. He came to America. He landed and made a home in Morrisville, Pennsylvania. And if you would sit in his presence as I had, and you could see him tell about his mother country, but the love he has for America, and if you could look in his eyes, you could realize he could lead a revolution. But his eyes tear up when he talks about becoming an American citizen. That great, brave man felt that deeply about being an American citizen with all the rights and privileges of any other American citizen. He was equal. Well, John Pazgai met a Hungarian woman. They were married. She became a citizen. He went to work for International Harvester in Morrisville, Pennsylvania, and he began to make his American dream come true. John and Mary were able to buy a very humble little home in Morrisville. When International Harvester pulled out and he was out of work, they pooled together their savings. They bought an old ramshackle building next door. He remodeled it, painted it up, fixed it up, and put a sign up there. Pazgai's Truck Repair Shop. Very proud of that. He was an American businessman. Well, they were then able to put their two daughters through college. They had 2 parcels of property, and they kept saving their money, living very humbly. They put their daughters through college. When their daughters graduated from college, they rented space on a billboard across the street from Morrisville, which isn't the most beautiful place near Philadelphia. It's the industrial suburb of Philadelphia. But they rented the billboard space that said, "Congratulations, Mom and Dad, because of you, the American dream has come true for us, Vicki and Gloria." John wasn't through dreaming. There was a parcel of property across the street from his home and his business where he envisioned having a bigger truck repair shop. It was a 14-acre parcel of property that had historically, over the last 40 years, been used as an unofficial dump by the people in Morrisville. He checked the status of the property. There was no cloud on the title. The only thing he found was an easement for the city of Morrisville for a wastewater runoff ditch that ran kitty-corner across his property. There was no designation about wetlands. However, it was clearly designated by the Land Use Planning and Zoning Commission as commercial property. John mortgaged everything he had and everything he had worked for to pay cash for these 14 acres. He did. And they went in and started cleaning up. And they pulled out old car bodies, old motors, old bathtubs, old toilets, bed springs, bottles, anything you can imagine. They pulled it out. Plus, an adjacent property owner was a tire repair store, and over years they had thrown out thousands of tires on this property. And what had happened was, when the tires got building up, the wastewater runoff that collected in a culvert under the road and it was supposed to exhaust in this ditch across the property would back up because of the tires being there, because of the negligence of Morrisville in their failure to maintain their own property. The water backed up, and then it would seep through the tires. When John and Vicki and Gloria went in and pulled out 7,000 tires, I can hardly handle one tire. But I mean, it was real work pulling out 7,000 tires, taking them off to be burned properly in a hazardous disposal facility, paying to have it done. And so they hauled away the 7,000 tires, and they brought in clean fill dirt and never did touch the ditch. There's no other creeks in there. They never did touch the ditch with fill dirt. And the local units of government said, it's quite all right, it's your own property, as long as it's clean fill dirt, go ahead and bring it in. So he did. Well, same thing happened as with O.C. Mills. John was working in his truck repair shop, and in come the federal government with their badges. They put him in handcuffs, they arrest him, put him in leg irons. Remember, we're going to make an example out of these immigrants and rebels. And they hauled him off, the U.S. Marshals hauled him off, and his family didn't know where. Very unsophisticated family. They never had a lawyer except to draw up a will. And so they didn't know what to do. Finally, after 2 days, the girls located their father and said, can we come and get our dad? We don't have a lawyer, what do we do? And they said, don't worry about a lawyer, just bring your checkbook. And so they did. And he'd already gone through arraignment, and they posted bond. The authorities took the check and said, but just one more thing we need, and that is we need to search your home for guns. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there usually has to be a reasonable cause to believe that a crime has been committed with something you're searching for to get a search warrant, right? Right. No search warrant. They just held their father hostage until they agreed to allow for a search. But even in the wildest stretch of your imagination, how can you imagine that by pulling 7,000 tires out and allowing a stream to go as it was purposed to go, a gun was not held to the head of the tires? I mean, a gun was not used in the commission of this crime. But they were still searching the home of John Pazgai for guns. And the girls will tell you that when the agents came in, they went through every square inch of their mother's home. The girls were in their bedroom when the agents came up and went through their college papers, high school papers, their books, their clothes, their underwear, tipped up their bed springs, looked under their bed, never did find any guns, either in the truck repair shop or in the home. So John Posguy was let out with a cloud over his future, but he was still able to work in his shop. This man worked 18 hours a day. His girls will tell you his hands were never clean because of ground-in dirt. But it was a badge of courage to him because he loved working. Well, John Posguy had to stand trial before Federal District Judge Burns in the Fourth Circuit Court in Philadelphia, in the Federal District Court in Philadelphia. And it was a jury trial, and he went through the yellow pages to find an attorney, and he finally found a man who would come in and sit with him and prepare the necessary papers for the court proceedings. And so he did, knowing not much about defending somebody up for a federal environmental crime. And so the issue of jurisdiction that I explained to you, that the federal government has jurisdiction over natural waterways, when that came up and the U.S. attorney said the federal government has jurisdiction, this naive attorney failed to object on the record on the very key question of governmental jurisdiction, which is the linchpin to the entire case. He failed to object on the record. Not because he was stupid, not because he was negligent or was committing malpractice. It's because our attorneys, most plaintiffs' attorneys, our attorneys don't get into environmental law. The only people who really get into environmental law are the attorneys who work for these organizations well funded by the insiders. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm not an attorney. I taught at the law school, but I'm not an attorney. I can't get behind the bar, but I have read the laws, and I know we can make them work for us as well as against us. It's just we need to encourage young men and women to go into plaintiffs' environmental law. There's a lot of need out there in business. There's money to be made in that area. We simply don't have them. But anyway, failed to object on the record. And so it came time for the decision, and the judge instructed the jury that you only have one decision to make. Did John Posguy destroy a wetlands or didn't he? And he read to them what the statute says out of the Army Corps of Engineers regulations. And the statute does not define the difference between wetlands that are caused by acts of man, even negligent acts of man, and acts of nature. If it's a wetland, no matter how it was created, it's a wetland. So the very simple question for a group of naive people who didn't understand what jury nullification was, if we had just had one person in there, in that jury, who could have said, this crime that he's been accused of is not appropriate to what he did, and I say not guilty. But no, they followed the very narrow judge's instruction, and of course they came back and said, guilty. Guilty. This man who fought for freedom was found guilty in an American court of law of crimes against the United States. Well, Judge Burns was going to make an example out of John Posguy. And in 1988, the Federal Crime Sentencing Act was passed, and that was an act that said, remember, it said all of those terrorists and those drug smugglers and those mass rapists and mass murderers, we're going to get those bad guys and we're going to put them behind bars, and they're never going to have a chance to get out on parole. And so with great hoopla, we passed the 1988 Federal Crime Act, and the intent of the law I agree with, and I think most of us would, except that's what Judge Burns sentenced John Posguy under. The 1988 Federal Crime Act, the worst sentencing crime act he could. John Posguy was sentenced to 3 years in Allenwood Federal Penitentiary with no hope of parole. In addition to that, John was fined $200,000 plus $2,000 for restitution. He'd already mortgaged everything he had. He wasn't able to work. He had to go to Allenwood Federal Penitentiary. The bank was saying, where's my money? A horrible, horrible situation. Well, that's when I got the case. And so the only thing that we can do is to be able to elevate the understanding of the American people. And so we took the John Posguy case, finally we were able to persuade Paul Kamenar from the Washington Legal Foundation to take the case legally. We tried to appeal to the Supreme Court. There was no hope because there was no objection on the record in the key linchpin jurisdictional issue. So we started making a big issue about it, had it in all the major newspapers. Even the Washington Post gave us favorable write-ups. Can you believe that? and the Washington Times, of course, Los Angeles Times, the San Francisco Examiner, the New York Times. I mean, the Paz Guy case was all over the place. It was written up in magazines. It was in last December's Reader's Digest. It was on CNN 4 times, Current Affairs twice. And finally, armed with familiarity of the case, we went into Congress in order to get support to present a petition to George Bush for presidential commutation of this sentence. Now, surely, of all sentences, I mean, George Bush has only commuted one sentence, and that was of an admitted bank robber. So we figured that we had probably a fair shot at getting the president to commute this sentence, especially with all the pressure we were able to generate through lobbying activities from both sides of the aisle. He wouldn't budge. Dan Quayle worked like a beaver for us. His staff was wonderful, but he couldn't get around William Riley. And you see, William E. Riley didn't want his agency to look bad. No, there was not any redress in the Supreme Court. We were not able to get a presidential commutation. The president gave us a non-victory. We got a federal variance to the Federal Crime Sentencing Act, and he was allowed out on work release. John Paz Guy is now back at work. When I first talked to him in prison, the one thing he said is, "I can't stand it because my hands are so clean." But thank goodness his hands are dirty again. And he's back working during the daytime, but he has a monitor around his ankle so they can monitor every move this man makes. That isn't the end of the story. 2 months ago, I received a call from John. He was very upset. He just received a letter from the Naturalization Immigration Service, and he faxed the letter to me, and they were proceeding ahead to deport him back to Hungary because he's a convicted felon. Ladies and gentlemen, with fear and intimidation, with confusion, they will win the war. But we have to stand on the promises. You know, the scriptures tell us ours isn't a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind. That we must be wise as serpents, very discerning, but as harmless as doves. And I believe that word. And I think that's what we have to stand on. There are other ways that I want to discuss with you, but I want you to first know and understand the extent the government has already gone to in intimidation. Just up in the Adirondacks, there are 12 different layers of laws after those people's private property. I mean, the commission, who alone said you could no longer build one house on just 42 acres, but tried to expand it up to 2,000 acres, was out to lunch. And I thank these freedom fighters in this northern New York area for the stand that they have taken. But I don't care what the personality is. I don't care who they are. If they're fighting for the principles that we know to be true, we must be there with them. Because you see, remember what Alexander Solzhenitsyn said when he came to America, and the press said, "Is it really true that the Soviets have murdered hundreds of thousands of people, some say millions, and why didn't we know about it?" And Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, because they did it one at a time. And that's what they're doing to us. And whether we like our neighbor or not, if he's being treated unfairly, we've got to take the same attitude that they did in the colonial times, because if their neighbor was in trouble, they were there. We've got to emerge out and realize the battlefield is in the hearing rooms of our local units of government. Another thing that has happened that I must tell you about is the Randy Weaver case in Idaho. Has anyone heard of that case? That case involves a man who was reported by the Eastern press as an Aryan Nation radical white supremacist who went over the deep end, shot his wife, shot his 14-year-old son, and shot a marshal. That's what was reported out here. I want to tell you what really happened. Randy Weaver served with great distinction in the Special Forces next to Bo Gritz. Bo Gritz, as you remember, was the man who was the most decorated veteran out of Vietnam. He's the man that they made the movies Rambo about. I mean, he was a real live Rambo. He's a God-fearing man, a very strong Christian who loves his country, loves his wife, loves his family, and doesn't mind standing on anybody's turf to respectfully talk about it. I'm not here promoting Bo Gritz in his presidential race. I'm not here promoting or unpromoting anybody. I'm here to inform you. But Randy Weaver served beside Bo Gritz, and he served with great distinction in the Special Forces. And after Randy was discharged from serving his country as he wanted to do, because he's a great American and he loves America, he went back to his home in Iowa, and after realizing what his children were being taught in the public schools, decided it would be far better if he and his wife educated their children at home. Because Iowa laws and regulations are not friendly to homeschoolers, they decided to move to a hill up in northern Idaho. I mean, when I say a hill, I mean a tall mountain, just south of the Canadian border in northern Idaho, and that's wild country out there. And they decided to live off the land. And I know people up there. And I'm a board member of the Rutherford Institute in Idaho, and so the Rutherford Institute became involved in the issue that I'm about to tell you about, and so I was in touch with my friends up there as to what was actually happening. What happened was that in January of 1991, the federal government claimed that Randy Weaver, who had been asked in 1985 by the United States government to infiltrate the Aryan nations up there, and Randy Weaver told the federal government, no, I don't want to work doing this spying job. I just want to be left alone. Randy Weaver, people will tell you, was well loved by the neighbors. People used to go up there and have picnics. They used to worship together. Randy finally, because of the event I'm going to tell you about, didn't go into town because he really did fear for his life. And in 1985, after he was approached by the federal government, he wrote and signed an affidavit that was notarized that he no longer felt that he and his family were safe and that they must isolate themselves on Weaver Mountain. And so they did. And for year after year, neighbors went up there. The family went to town, but Randy always stayed at home. He was a very friendly and loving man. In January 1991, the federal government claimed Randy Weaver tried to sell an undercover agent a gun that was less than a quarter of an inch, whose barrel was less than a quarter of an inch too short. Randy Weaver said, I didn't try to sell anybody a gun, but this probably was a trumped-up thing. But even if we give the government the benefit of the doubt that this could have occurred, which I don't believe it did, nevertheless, the end result of what happened was utterly tragic. 2 months ago, unbeknownst to Randy, the government for 8 months had been surveilling the family. I mean, the attorney and the trial that I sat through showed that they had even taken aerial photographs of the girls out working in the garden with sidearms on. And so that demonstrated that these are rebels, and we can't contend with rebels. Nothing was said about the fact, ladies and gentlemen, this is serious grizzly bear country. And you don't go out any place without a sidearm because you don't negotiate with grizzly bears. He has the weight of way, and he's a very vicious animal. And you don't go anywhere in that country without having arms. There are wolves, there are coyotes, there are dangerous animals. So that was just an understanding of the way of life. I understand it, and I'm a city girl, but I go up north whenever I can. Nevertheless, they took these pictures, and they were beginning to survey the Weaver land in order to make a capture of the family. And 2 months ago, the dogs began barking. And they had 3 fairly big dogs that could flesh out game, one being a big old yellow lab that had been just a part of the family. And beside, of course, the dogs, the family consisted of Randy and his wife, Vicki, and their 8-month-old nursing baby, an 8-month-old girl, a 16-year-old daughter, an 11-year-old daughter, and 14-year-old boy by the name of Sammy. Sammy and Old Yeller, the old lab, were just real buddies, and that old dog was trained to take a sled down to the lake and haul back barrels of water in the wintertime. He really was a working animal on that family farm up there. Well, Old Yeller and the other 2 dogs who were tethered began barking ferociously one day, and that usually meant game or grizzly bears were out there. And so Randy and another young man, Kevin Harris, age 24, who had been raised by the Weavers through his teenage years and still lived with them, got their guns. Randy and Sammy and Kevin got their guns, and they went outside. Sammy and Kevin followed Old Yeller down a trail. Randy went around the road because in the area the dog was headed, you knew you could flush the game out down this ravine, and Randy could get them at the end. That's how we hunt up there. I mean, you flush the game out. And so they took off with the dog, and unbeknownst to them, Old Yeller was just lopping away. He had his nose on the scent, and he rounded a bend and up out of the bushes came some men with high-powered rifles, and they shot the dog dead in front of Sammy. Sammy takes his gun out, and he fires in the air, and he said, "You so-and-sos, you shot my dog," at which point in time, they shot him in the arm. Sammy turns around to run back to the house, and this is all verified fact that's on the record in the court of law in the first trial. He turns around, he runs back towards the house, and he right in front of Kevin Harris, Sammy takes 2 bullets in the back. The U.S. Marshals, who had infiltrated the property without a search warrant, without even an arrest warrant, they infiltrated the property and ambushed these people. Kevin Harris fired back as the fire was being exchanged. Wouldn't you? I sure would. He fired back, and in the exchange of fire, a U.S. Marshal was killed also. We don't know whether the Marshal was killed by friendly fire because there was 8 of them altogether, and they all fired massive amounts of shots. They got off numerous rounds, and there were people behind Marshal Deegan who was shot. But we'll never know. They have the body. Nevertheless, Randy ran up the road. Kevin said, "Randy, get to the house. We've got to get to the house, get to the house." And so they ran in the house, they barricaded themselves, and Randy knew the moment that he dreaded was here. And so in the dead of night, after protecting his family, Kevin and Randy, the parents grieving very badly about their son laying out there, Kevin and Randy snuck out in the dead of night to go out and retrieve the body of their boy and bring it back to the house. According to the Old Testament tradition, they prepared the body for burial by preparing it with spices and oil and wrapping it. And they took Sammy back out to a shed, and they sat several hours with their boy and were able to get back in. The next night, Randy was grieving so badly about his boy that he wanted to go back out and sit with him again. And you see, nobody knew the boy had been shot at that point in time. But Randy wanted to go back out and sit with his son, and so he did. And Kevin Harris went with him. And as they knew dawn was coming and the dead of night would be lessening and their safety would be lessening, they started to make their way back to the house. And Randy was shot as he started to go back in the shoulder with a high-powered rifle with UV scope on it, which they can see through the night with. And as they ran for the front door with Randy, the wounded individual, the father, running through the door first, the mother had opened up the door, was holding her 8-month-old baby in her arms. Randy went through the door first, then Kevin Harris went through the door in the same split instant that with another high-powered rifle with a scope on it 50 feet away, they were given the order to shoot Vicki Weaver in the head. They shot her. She died instantly. As Kevin Harris ran by her as she collapsed, he took human shrapnel in the side. Bone fragment, tissue fragment, it became engorged through his arm and into his side and into his lungs. So the mother was now dead. The 16-year-old girl, the 11-year-old girl took care of the wounds of their father and Kevin Harris, and they set about preparing the body of their dead mother. They prepared her body, wrapped her in a sheet, and put her under the kitchen table. For 8 days, this family staved off the federal government. Bo Gritz heard about this. He went up to the mountain. Finally, after imposing citizens' arrest to get their attention, he finally was able to negotiate with Randy Weaver. He was able to get Kevin Harris off the mountain, and then he had to announce to the people that the wife, Vicki Weaver, had been killed 8 days before. And the people, the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of friends and neighbors who came to the Kevin Harris's, or came to the Weaver Mountain to send food up and send prayers up and support, just about went wild when they found out Vicki Weaver had been murdered. The federal government knew about it, and it was kept secret. Bo Gritz had to walk over to those people and say, if we lose our head now, we lose the battle because you can't win. There will be about 500 dead people if you try to storm the gates. So you must conduct yourself as the Savior would have you conduct yourself. And he calmed them down. Finally, after 2 or 3 more days of negotiations, Bo Gritz was able to convince Randy to come off the mountain. Kevin Harris was nearly dead when he came off. He was taken to a hospital in Spokane. Bo Gritz had been able to secure the services of one of the country's finest constitutional lawyers, Jerry Spence, who defended Imelda Marcos successfully, and numerous other luminaries. And Jerry Spence is giving his time for free, but it has to be paid for his expenses out of pocket. Nevertheless, Bo Gritz was able to get Jerry Spence on, and armed with that, he said, Randy, I promise you the courts of law, I promise you on our friendship as comrades in arms, that the courts of law, when you're protected by Jerry Spence, will treat you fairly. Jerry Spence had made an agreement with the U.S. Attorney in Idaho that instead of going through a grand jury investigation, they would go through a fact-finding hearing, and that's the trial that I set in on. After 3 days of trial, Jerry Spence was wiping the government up with the floor. I mean, he was just killing them. And so what the U.S. Attorney did was break his promise, conduct a secret grand jury investigation, and came in with an indictment where they demanded that the judge abort the fact-finding hearing, sentence Randy to no bond, no bail, and then hold the real trial, the other trial, in late October, 1st November. Jerry Spence came unglued. I mean, he told the court they've broken the law. They know, Your Honor, you have no other way but to rule for Randy Weaver. Nevertheless, this judge was a federal magistrate. That's the lowest on the rungs of the federal ladder. And as has been historic, he simply turned around, washed his hands, and bumped it up to the higher level of the federal district court, allowed them to come in with an indictment not only of Kevin Harris and Randy Weaver for aiding and abetting the murder of a U.S. Marshal, but also they indicted the 16-year-old daughter, the 11-year-old daughter, and the 8-month-old baby. Now, Jerry Spence has had a lot of fun with that one. This is the first time in American history when an 8-month-old baby has been indicted for a crime that carries with it the death penalty. That's the extent of ridiculousness that has happened. What do we do about this, ladies and gentlemen? Well, first we have to understand the laws of God and the relationship between God and man, and then we need to become aware of what some of our rights are. They are beginning to make great headway because we are such friendly and open people. When we have an agent of OSHA come into our business and say, we just sort of want to look around and see if there's any problem here, do you have any problem with that? Or we have an agent from the Fish and Wildlife Service that comes onto our property and says, we just want to look around, do you have any standing water? Or we have an agent from the Planning and Zoning Commission that says, we just want to come in and do a little mapping and surveying here, do you have any problem? Most of us say no. Help yourself, we want to be friendly people. And so they do. They gather all the evidence that it will take for us to have a diminished land value. What we need to do, ladies and gentlemen, is get tough. Wise as serpents and as harmless as doves, but wise as serpents. We have a protection. It's called a search warrant. We need to ask any agent of the government for their search warrant, and you need to understand that there has to be reasonable cause for them to acquire a search warrant, that there is some sort of a crime. And so that search warrant, you must read it when they present a search warrant. Without a search warrant, no, they may not look at anything. You need to be friendly, but very firm. The search warrant should have the exact date that the agents are allowed to be on by the court of law, are allowed to be on your property. That search warrant should specifically describe what they're searching for and the area in which they are looking. You take them, if there is a search warrant, you take them to that area and that area alone. If they want to look around, they need to get another search warrant. We need to make them start jumping through the hoops. It's not fun not to be friendly. It's not like us. But we've got to understand they might be nice people, and we love the people, but we just detest the sin of taking our property and using our good nature to do it with. The second thing is that we need to begin to build a paper trail. If you have any agent that you are fussing with, I don't care what agency, of federal, state, or local units of government, and they make a statement, you have violated planning and zoning laws, or you have violated the wetland laws, you must say, well, would you please put it in writing, citing your authority and the specific site, not a generalized law, and specifically where the violation is. You must begin to build a paper trail. And everything they tell you, do not take their word for it. It is not naughty to ask them to send you a letter. So you begin to build a paper trail. If you have to go to court, the next thing you need to do is to get into your own records. You need to utilize the state and federal Freedom of Information Acts to acquire your own records so you can see what's going on and who the players are that they have the advantage of knowing about. And if they say we have an anonymous complaint, you need to say, this isn't a case unless you name the person who is complaining. Because an agency cannot enforce the laws on anonymity. You know, that's a very basic doctrine in law. We have a right to stand before our accusers, and so you need to flesh them out. They don't need to be protected by the agencies. So you need to ask for them to write down who the accuser is, and your courts will generally back you up. Secondly, after understanding, you need to get it in writing, you need to have a search warrant, you need to protect yourself from the agents by building a paper trail. We also need to start looking at judicial decisions, because I think the judges here run, what, every 10 years or 4 years, or how often do they run on the ballot? I think it's every 10 years in New York. And see, this is a demonstration that most of us don't understand what is going on with our judicial elections. We just sort of think that's a nice name, it's a familiar name, we vote them in again. Well, if we would just target one judge that we'd like to make a good example on, and we would absolutely turn the judicial system upside down in this area. You know, we have little old ladies that like to research, little old ladies in Berkeys, we call them now, who like to research in law libraries, and we just need to get in there and research the record of one single judge and begin to expose that record. And we need to put together a campaign against one judge and run a good, strong constitutional lawyer for him and win. And I can tell you, it will be a good spanking for your judiciary here. Much of your land use problems come out of case decisions from the state courts. Another thing is that unless you have an attorney who is willing to stand on the law and not be intimidated because of the whims of the judge or the whims of either the U.S. Attorney, the State Attorney General's office, or your local DA or your defender here, prosecutor here, we need to have somebody who's willing to stand on the letter of the law. And oftentimes, I don't hope I'm not offending any attorneys in this audience, but I think you will understand that sometimes we need to look outside our county for attorneys unless we have someone who's willing to, you know, to risk their reputation by displeasing a judge. So often we hear attorneys say, that will make the judge mad, and so you really need to compromise here. Well, it really upsets us when we have to compromise half our land away, because, you know, making the judge mad by standing on the law is a small issue compared to what plaintiffs very often have to give up in mitigation and compromise. There is no sense in that. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, we as a nation need to begin to look at the doctrine of sovereign immunity. Isn't it interesting? Even the 8-month-old baby has been indicted for the murder of a marshal, and nobody is saying anything about the murder of Sammy. Nobody is saying anything about the deliberate murder of Vicky. Nobody is saying anything about the trespass that occurs every day on your property by people who are not welcome and who have no warrant to be on your property. Nobody says anything about the agents who demean those of us who stand up for rights, demean us in the press by saying things about us that are untrue, and yet we can't get at them individually for slander and libel. You know this has happened for generation after generation. They do not need to stand accountable, they being agents of the government, do not need to stand accountable because of the protection of the doctrine of sovereign immunity. Sure, we have the Federal Tort Claims Act, and sure we have a State Tort Claims Act, but it doesn't work, or we'd see a major change. We need to go after the doctrine of sovereign immunity. The king does not need protection. Thomas Jefferson said we need to chain the government and free the people. And because of the doctrine of sovereign immunity, where they are protected and where the government has to give us permission to sue an agency, they are able to get by with seeing to it that today the average American does not have his day in court because we don't have the same protections. We need to level the playing field there, ladies and gentlemen. But most importantly, as the John Perch Society stands on the fact that education is our best tool, we need, as Christian, God-fearing people, to take up the sword of truth and the shield of faith and stand, as it says in Ephesians 6, and after all else is done, we need to continue to stand and stand and stand. You know, I remember in 1975 when I read about the poet Gary Snyder, who won the Pulitzer Prize, and in an article in Forbes magazine, September 2nd, 1991, in an article called The Gaggling Geese, they again quoted Gary Snyder, who won the Pulitzer Prize, for his radical call for an ultimate democracy in which plants and animals are also people. He wrote that they should be given a place and a voice in the political discussions of the humans, and that what we must do is find a way to incorporate the other people into the councils of government. I laughed in 1975 when I heard about Gary Snyder. I'm not laughing today. After a few years in 1980, a leading ecologist, Joseph Petula, said, "The Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act embody the legal idea that a listed non-human resident of the United States is guaranteed in a special sense life and liberty." I laughed then. I don't laugh now. You know, I'm going to close with just a couple of stories. When I was working for Steve Sims as his chief of staff, because I was a single woman and I was a single mother and I had children at home and didn't want to live inside the Beltway. I didn't want to move out of Idaho into Washington, D.C. And so we set up our major case work and our press work and everything out in Idaho, and we had a skeleton staff back in Washington, D.C. But as chief of staff, I had to fly back there about once a month, and I'd always take a little gift home to my children. And one time when I went back there, Steve said, "My wife Fran has found the most incredible gift shop in Alexandria, Virginia, and I'm telling everybody to buy gifts from this woman because she's incredible, and I want you to get to know her, Helen." And so I went down to this little gift shop in Alexandria, and this is the incredible story I heard. This woman had vision. And see, vision is contained in our spirit and our minds, and enables us to envision what can be for the future. This woman was born at the turn of the century in Russia. In 1978, she was 78 years old. She still held great love for her mother country. You could tell when you talked to her. And in 1917, this woman experienced the annihilation of her entire family in the hands of the Red Army. She was the only survivor. Her friends smuggled her out of Russia and put her on a steamer freighter bound for a free country, Cuba. She met a man, married him, they had a family, they worked, and they lived happily until 1956 and 57, when Castro took over, and for the second time in her life, she lost her entire family again. But with the grit that we can understand, her vision was still there. And she climbed on a motorboat in the northern shores of Cuba and made her way to the southern tip of Key West, Florida, to the land of the free and the home of the brave. And I'm a pretty big girl, but I remember how little she was, and I took her shoulders in my hands, and I looked her in the face, a beautiful face with very alive eyes, and I said, "I am so glad things have gone well for you in America, and I'm so glad you don't have to start over again." And you know, she said, "I could do it, honey. I could start over again. My problem is, what if there is no place else to go?" You see, ladies and gentlemen, as God commanded the Israelites time and time again, we need to take back the land. As God told David that you don't move forward until you hear the rustling in the bushes, and I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to move with the army that we know we can amass, an army that is knowledgeable, an army that is dedicated, an army who knows how to fight in the battle fronts of the hearing rooms today. Yes, there is a rustling in the bushes. It's time we take up our arms and that we move forward. You know, Sitting Bull said it very well. Sitting Bull was that great leader of the Sioux Nation. And when the American Army broke their promise to the Sioux Nation, after they had promised they would never slay women and children, the U.S. Army knew they were in trouble, and so they appointed Custer to lead the Army into battle with the Sioux Nation. They didn't think they'd go after Custer because Custer had a child by a Sioux native out there, and who was part of the Sioux Nation. But when Custer came in, the Sioux, of course, ambushed him, and the rest is history. But what we must remember is after the Sioux were defeated by the U.S. Army, and some of them were rounded up, and Sitting Bull stood with full regalia on in front of the United States Congress and spoke English and said, You made us many promises. You never kept but one. You promised to take our land, and you took it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time we reclaim our land. Thank you.